Okay, so in this unit, we're going to discuss urbanization and its challenges. Urbanization is the rapid growth of cities, and one of the causes of urbanization was large scale immigration and then migration. So, immigration, we're talking about people coming from other parts of the world, primarily Europe, but obviously some immigration from Asia and from Latin and Central America. And then migration, because of consolidation of farming, we have a migration of Americans from rural areas into the cities. So the mass growth, the rapid growth of America's cities, or the rapid growth of cities is urbanization. So we're talking about the cities of America in the Midwest and the Northeast growing from about 10 million inhabitants in the late 1800s to about 54 million inhabitants by the early 20th century. So rapid growth of cities. And cities are going to struggle to respond to the needs of inhabitants in the urban areas, we're going to look at problems primarily, some of the challenges of that rapid urbanization. Okay, so know the regions that experience this rapid growth: the Northeast and the Midwest. Cities in the Midwest, we're talking about Detroit, Chicago, cities that experience rapid growth. And then on the Atlantic seaboard in the Northeast, cities like Boston and New York are going to experience this rapid. Philadelphia will experience this rapid growth as well. Okay, so why is it that most immigrants choose the cities? We know that these new immigrants are coming in largely poor and unskilled as laborers. So the city represents the easiest access to opportunity for them because of industrialization. You don't need to have skill to work in the factories, and so easy employment. And also, the cities are going to have for them things in close proximity, which means they won't need access necessarily to their own transportation. So, immigrants are going to settle more easily and affordable in cities. There's jobs and there's also housing for them, cheap and available housing. An interesting fact that helps to understand immigration and how it's such a strong factor that's causing urbanization. By 1900, there are more Irish in New York City than in Dublin, Ireland. The population of Dublin, Ireland is less than the number of Irish people in New York City in 1910, which is quite interesting. So by 1910, immigrants make up more than half of the population of 18 major cities. So a response to this rapid urbanization and especially immigration is, and write this down, an Americanization movement. There is a movement to Americanize immigrants, meaning to assimilate these immigrants into American culture. And we see that in large part through education. And this movement is led by the government of major cities. In public education. They do things like they teach the Pledge of Allegiance in the early 20th century. And they use the American public education system to teach immigrants English as the dominant language. And so it's the education system is used to transform new immigrants into assimilated Americans. And then we'll talk in just a second about the settlement house movement and how this movement also is used to assimilate immigrants, especially adult immigrants, into the mainstream American culture. But Americanization is that movement to assimilate immigrants into the larger culture, and this is a government movement. So migration from country to city. We talked about immigration, so what about migration internally? farming is becoming more and more mechanized. Okay, with the mechanical reaper is going to reduce the need for labor, the need for hands. So fewer people needed in farming. McCormick's reaper and the steel plow, John Deere, all of these things are bringing farming into the modern age, and it's reducing the amount of labor that's needed for farming. And so you're going to see two things happen: fewer people working in farming and the consolidation of farms. So farms are becoming more and more corporate, more and more owned by corporations and um, large franchises, large businesses. Okay. And the people that are disposable, okay, these expendable laborers are largely sharecroppers, very poor white families, and large numbers of African American agricultural workers will move to northern cities to find jobs. Okay, so speaking of African American workers, many of them leave the South not only because of economic hardship, but also because of social injustice and the oppression of segregation. So we're talking about a great migration. From the late 1800s to about 1910, there's a steady flow of African Americans into urban cities in Detroit and Chicago, um, and they're moving in to find work. Now they find in the North its own set of problems. There's racism in the North. Many whites not only resent immigrants but also African Americans because they see them as competition for industrial jobs. So understand the push and pull, what's pushing not only immigrants out of Europe, like natural disasters and political unrest and the lack of available jobs. That's the pushing people out of Europe, but also understand the push in the South, pushing people, agrarian workers out of the South. And then the pull, the attraction is opportunity. Jobs, increase wages, and economic opportunity. Here's a map that shows the loss of African American population in states like Oklahoma, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama. Alabama loses about 4% of its African American population. Mississippi loses about 5% of its African American population. And look at the states that are gaining. The African American population increases in Illinois, in Indiana, in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, and in New York. So the loss of South Carolina's African American population decreases by 7%, Florida by 7%. So that's interesting there. Okay, so the problems that urbanization brings: a problem in housing. So as middle class working families leave the city, they usually leave these one family dwellings and they move to areas outside of the city. Okay. And then what you have, the urban poor that floods the one family dwellings, and they then become multi-family dwellings. So these overcrowded one family dwellings become known as tenements. So tenements are pictured here. Jacob Rees is a Dutch immigrant who comes into the United States, and he works at first with the police department, and he's like an investigator for the police department, and he starts to take pictures as he goes into New York City slums and becomes aware of the problem of the urban poor. So overcrowded housing, and one of the ways they respond to this is to create these multi-unit complexes that have one window, so for ventilation, and also air vents, but because of other issues like sanitation, because there's not a lot of regular garbage pickup that comes through, and so in the urban centers, they start to fill the vents with their trash, and that poses a problem. And because the stench and the smell, they board up the windows, and so the tenements just become even worse than what they were before. So garbage isn't collected very often, and there's an issue with air pollution. So what you're seeing here is one of Jacob Riis's photographs of a tenement. Other problems in the urban city: transportation. So, transportation is widely inadequate, and one of the responses to that is the subway system is a response to the transportation inadequacies that we see in the cities. Because the cities are growing so fast, though the city managers aren't quite sure how to provide clean water, and so cholera and typhoid fever are extremely common because waste is in the street, garbage is in the street, and instead of having plumbing inside these buildings, most of the cities just have like faucets on the street that people have to go down into the street and get their water and bring it up and boil it, and not a lot of people are doing that, and so we see very poor water quality. Over time, though, by the early 1900s, chlorination of water is one solution to the issue with poor water. Chlorination is something that by the early 1900s, some cities are implementing. Crime is an issue. New York City is the first to have a full-time police department. Pickpocketing and high crime rates, but even New York City's police department is so small that it's really not equipped to handle the crime in the city. And then fires, because the structures are mostly made of wood. In the mid 1800s, most of the buildings aren't built of brick or steel or concrete, and so not only do you have wooden structures, but you also have kerosene lamps are lighting the cities and candles, and so it's just a tinderbox waiting to explode. And all of these urban cities suffer fires pretty frequently, and in places like San Francisco, where you have frequent earthquakes, fires are going to be a byproduct of the earthquakes. Okay, so question. Okay, read the question, pause your screen, and select an answer. What you should have answered is cultural adjustment is a major objective of the movement to Americanize. Cultural adjustment. Okay, read the question and the answer options, pause your screen. Okay, so what factors most contributed to the Chicago fires? Widespread destruction. Was it firefighters' inability to communicate with recent immigrants, the city's limited water supply due to drought, theft of fire, or extensive wood frame construction in houses and business? What you should have answered here is D. Okay, urbanization. Read the answer options, pause your screen. Okay, so what you should have answered here is B, the growth of cities. All right, guys, I want you to examine Jacob Riis's pictures here. Captured images of the city by a photographer, and he would also be considered a muckraker, someone whose job exposes problems. Jacob Riis here exposing the problem of the urban poor, and it also encourages social responsibility, this idea that it is the responsibility of citizens and even the government to address the needs of the poor. It's kind of muckraking and exposing the depravity and the slum conditions of the urban poor. Jacob Riis also exposes some issues in child labor, with many of these tenements turning into sweatshops where